In a world where respect is earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifice, some people believe that gender determines worth on the battlefield. They couldn't be more wrong. What happens when a decorated war hero faces the ultimate test of proving her value not to enemies, but to the very people meant to stand beside her? Sometimes the most dangerous battles aren't fought with weapons, but with words that cut deeper than any blade. And, sometimes, the quietest voice in the room carries the most devastating truth. This is the story of a woman who refused to let anyone diminish her service, her sacrifices, or her scars. A story about the moment when silence became the most powerful weapon in a room full of powerful men. Because when you've stared death in the face and emerged victorious, dealing with ignorance becomes just another mission to complete. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Pentagon's polished floors as Colonel Sarah Martinez walked through the corridors with measured steps. Her uniform was immaculate, each ribbon and medal precisely placed, telling a story of service that spanned 15 years and 3 continents. At 38, she had earned her place among the military's elite, though she knew that some of her colleagues still questioned whether she truly belonged there. The briefing room buzzed with conversation as senior officers gathered for the monthly strategic review. Sarah took her usual seat near the back, a position she had chosen not out of humility, but out of tactical awareness. From there, she could observe everyone while maintaining a clear view of all exits. Old habits from the battlefield died hard, and, after 4 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq, Sarah's instincts remained razor-sharp. General Marcus Thompson commanded the room's attention as he entered, his imposing figure filling the doorway. At 55, Thompson was a Marine's Marine, with a chest full of decorations and a reputation for tough talk. He had risen through the ranks during peacetime and had managed to avoid the grueling combat deployments that defined Sarah's generation. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, and his uniform displayed the kind of pristine condition that came from spending more time in offices than foxholes. The briefing began with routine updates on training exercises, budget allocations, and personnel changes. Sarah listened attentively, making notes on her tablet and occasionally glancing around the room at her fellow officers. She recognized the mix of combat veterans and career bureaucrats, each bringing their own perspective to the table. Some had earned their ranks through bravery under fire, while others had climbed the ladder through political maneuvering and careful networking. Major James Rodriguez, who sat 2 seats away from Sarah, caught her eye and nodded respectfully. Rodriguez had served under her command in Kandahar province, where Sarah had led a special operations unit tasked with eliminating high-value targets. He remembered the night she had single-handedly cleared a compound filled with insurgents, saving 3 captured Marines in the process. That mission had earned her the Silver Star and the respect of everyone who served with her. As the briefing progressed, General Thompson began discussing upcoming joint operations with international allies. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard, and his opinions were delivered as facts rather than suggestions. Sarah noticed how some of the younger officers hung on his every word, eager to align themselves with someone of his rank and influence. The conversation shifted to personnel assignments for a critical mission in Eastern Europe. Several names were mentioned, each accompanied by Thompson's assessment of their capabilities. Sarah knew that her name would eventually come up, as she had submitted a formal request to lead one of the tactical units. Her extensive experience in urban warfare and her fluency in 3 languages made her an ideal candidate for the assignment. When her name finally appeared on the discussion agenda, Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came before any important engagement. She had learned to channel that nervous energy into focused determination, a skill that had served her well in countless dangerous situations. Her hands remained steady as she prepared to answer questions about her qualifications and strategic approach. Colonel Patricia Hayes, the deputy commander for operations, spoke first about Sarah's impressive service record. Hayes had been a mentor to Sarah during her early years, and she understood the unique challenges faced by women in combat roles. Her endorsement carried significant weight, as she was known for her uncompromising standards and her ability to identify exceptional talent regardless of gender or background. Several other officers added their support for Sarah's assignment, citing her tactical brilliance and her proven ability to lead diverse teams under extreme pressure. The room seemed to be building consensus around her selection, and Sarah allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She had worked hard for this opportunity, and it appeared that her efforts were about to pay off. But then, General Thompson cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. His expression had changed, becoming more stern and skeptical. Sarah sensed that the conversation was about to take an unexpected turn, and she steeled herself for whatever challenge lay ahead. Years of combat experience had taught her to remain calm under pressure, and she drew upon that training now. The general's voice cut through the silence like a blade. His words were carefully chosen, but their intent was unmistakable. He questioned whether someone with Sarah's background could handle the physical and psychological demands of leading such a critical mission. His tone suggested that he had serious doubts about her capabilities, despite the overwhelming evidence of her success in similar situations. Sarah felt the blood rise in her cheeks, but her expression remained neutral. She had faced skepticism before, often from people who had never heard a shot fired in anger. The general's comments stung, not because they were accurate, but because they revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what she had accomplished during her years of service. Other officers in the room shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some had served alongside Sarah and knew firsthand of her courage and competence. Others were career politicians who understood the delicate dynamics at play. The tension was palpable, and everyone waited to see how Sarah would respond to the challenge. Major Rodriguez clenched his fists under the table, remembering how Sarah had carried him to safety after he was wounded by an improvised explosive device. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Barnes, another combat veteran, recalled the night Sarah had held a strategic position for 6 hours against overwhelming odds, allowing his unit to complete their extraction. These men knew the truth about Sarah's capabilities, but they also understood the unspoken rules about challenging a superior officer's judgment in a formal setting. Sarah took a slow, deliberate breath and chose her words carefully. She knew that her response would be remembered long after the briefing ended, and she wanted to make sure it accurately reflected her professionalism and her commitment to the mission. Her voice was steady and respectful, but it carried an underlying strength that commanded attention. She began by acknowledging the general's concerns and expressing her understanding of the mission's importance. She outlined her relevant experience, citing specific operations where her leadership had made the difference between success and failure. Her presentation was factual and measured, avoiding any hint of defensiveness or emotion that might be interpreted as weakness. As Sarah spoke, she noticed subtle changes in the room's atmosphere. Some officers leaned forward, paying closer attention to her words. Others glanced nervously between her and General Thompson, uncertain about how this confrontation would resolve. The air seemed charged with electricity, as if everyone understood that they were witnessing a pivotal moment. The general listened to her response with a skeptical expression, occasionally nodding but never appearing fully convinced. When Sarah finished speaking, he paused for what felt like an eternity before delivering his final assessment. His words would trigger a chain of events that would transform a routine briefing into something far more significant than anyone had expected. General Thompson leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on Sarah with a mixture of dismissal and condescension that made several officers in the room shift uncomfortably. The silence stretched for several seconds before he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of assumed authority and barely concealed prejudice. "Colonel Martinez," he began, his tone suggesting that he was about to deliver wisdom to someone who desperately needed it, "I appreciate your enthusiasm for this assignment, but I have serious reservations about your suitability for such a critical operation. Leadership in combat requires more than just following orders and completing missions. It demands the kind of physical presence and intimidation factor that can control a chaotic battlefield." Sarah felt her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, but her expression remained professionally neutral. She had heard variations of this argument throughout her career, usually from men who had never experienced the adrenaline-fueled chaos of actual combat. The general's words revealed more about his own insecurities and biases than they did about her capabilities. Thompson continued, warming to his theme as he noticed the rapt attention of his audience. "Furthermore, the psychological pressure of making life-and-death decisions in the heat of battle requires a certain mental toughness that, frankly, I question whether you possess. Combat leadership isn't about checking boxes on performance evaluations or accumulating ribbons and medals. It's about the ability to inspire fear in your enemies and absolute confidence in your troops." Several officers exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. Major Rodriguez gripped his pen so tightly that his knuckles turned white, while Lieutenant Colonel Barnes stared at his notepad as if it contained the most fascinating intelligence report ever written. The tension in the room was becoming suffocating, but no one dared interrupt a general mid-speech. The general's voice grew more confident as he built toward his main point. "Now, I'm not saying that women don't have their place in the military. They absolutely do. But there's a difference between support roles and combat leadership. There's a reason why certain positions have traditionally been filled by men, and it's not because of outdated thinking or institutional bias. It's because warfare is fundamentally about physical dominance and psychological intimidation. Sarah's mind flashed back to a night in Afghanistan when she had led a rescue mission into a Taliban stronghold. She remembered the weight of responsibility as she made split-second decisions that would determine whether her team members would return home to their families. She thought about the insurgent commander who had underestimated her because of her gender, a mistake that had cost him his life and saved dozens of innocent civilians. Thompson was far from finished with his lecture. Combat effectiveness is measured in confirmed kills, successful missions, and the ability to project strength in the face of overwhelming odds. These are not areas where political correctness or diversity initiatives should influence our decision-making process. We need leaders who can demonstrate their lethality through documented results, not through paperwork and committee recommendations. The word lethality hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. Sarah knew exactly what the general was implying, and she understood that he was challenging not just her qualifications for this particular mission, but her entire identity as a combat leader. His message was clear. In his opinion, she was a pretender who had been promoted beyond her capabilities through affirmative action rather than merit. Colonel Hayes cleared her throat delicately, preparing to defend her protégé, but Thompson raised his hand to silence her. He wasn't finished delivering his assessment, and he wanted to make sure everyone in the room understood his position completely. His next words would cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I've reviewed Colonel Martinez's service record, and, while it's certainly impressive from an administrative standpoint, I notice a significant gap in her documented combat achievements. Yes, she's participated in numerous operations, but I don't see the kind of verified kill count that I would expect from someone seeking to lead such a high-stakes mission. The room went dead silent. Several officers stopped breathing entirely, shocked by the general's boldness in questioning Sarah's combat record so directly and publicly. This wasn't just professional criticism, it was a personal attack designed to humiliate and diminish her in front of her peers and subordinates. Thompson continued, oblivious to or uncaring about the discomfort he was causing. In my experience, the most effective combat leaders are those who can demonstrate their lethality through concrete numbers. Confirmed kills, successful eliminations, documented neutralizations of enemy threats. These are the metrics that matter when you're responsible for other people's lives. Sarah's mind raced as she processed the implications of the general's challenge. He was essentially calling her combat record into question, suggesting that she had somehow inflated her achievements or been given credit for actions she hadn't personally performed. It was an accusation that struck at the very core of her professional identity and personal honor. Major Rodriguez was barely containing his anger, remembering the night Sarah had killed 3 insurgents with precision shots while under heavy fire, saving his entire unit from an ambush. He knew about operations that remained classified, missions where Sarah's marksmanship skills had eliminated high-value targets and prevented terrorist attacks. But protocol prevented him from speaking out in defense of his former commander. The general's voice took on a patronizing tone as he delivered what he clearly believed was his finishing blow. I understand that modern warfare involves many different types of contributions, and I'm sure Colonel Martinez has made valuable contributions in her own way. But, when we're talking about leading the most dangerous and critical operations, we need commanders who have proven themselves capable of taking lives when necessary. Thompson paused for effect, scanning the room to gauge the impact of his words. He seemed satisfied with the uncomfortable silence that had settled over the briefing. In his mind, he had successfully exposed what he saw as the military's misguided attempt to place unqualified personnel in critical positions for the sake of appearance rather than effectiveness. So, Colonel Martinez, he said, turning his attention directly to Sarah with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, perhaps you could enlighten us about your personal kill count. How many enemy combatants have you personally eliminated during your various deployments? I think it would be helpful for everyone here to understand exactly what kind of combat experience you're bringing to this leadership role. The question hung in the air like a challenge thrown down at a medieval tournament. Everyone in the room understood that this wasn't really about numbers or statistics. It was about power, respect, and the general's determination to put Sarah in what he considered her proper place. The other officers waited in tense silence, unsure whether they were about to witness a humiliation or something entirely different. Sarah sat perfectly still for a moment, her hands folded calmly in her lap as she processed the situation. She had faced many enemies during her career, from Taliban fighters to ISIS terrorists, but she had never expected to face such blatant disrespect from a fellow American officer in a Pentagon briefing room. The general had crossed every line of professional courtesy and military protocol, and now he was waiting for her response. The next few minutes would determine not just Sarah's future career prospects, but also the message that would be sent to every woman serving in the military about their value and their place in the hierarchy. General Thompson had no idea that he had just made the biggest mistake of his military career, and Sarah was about to show him exactly how wrong his assumptions really were. The silence that followed General Thompson's challenge seemed to stretch into eternity. Sarah remained motionless in her chair, her dark eyes fixed on the general with an intensity that made several officers shift nervously. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone present, as they realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in the sterile confines of the Pentagon's briefing rooms. Sarah's mind traveled back through 15 years of service, each mission and engagement flashing through her memory like scenes from a violent movie. She remembered her first confirmed kill in Fallujah, when she was just 25 years old and serving as a scout sniper. The insurgent had been preparing to detonate an explosive device near a school filled with children. Her single shot from 800 meters had saved countless innocent lives, but the weight of taking another human being's life had changed her forever. The general continued to watch her with smug satisfaction, clearly believing that he had cornered her into admitting her inadequacy. He had no idea that Sarah's silence wasn't born from uncertainty or embarrassment, but from the careful consideration of how much truth she was willing to share with someone who had demonstrated such profound ignorance and disrespect. Colonel Hayes glanced anxiously between Sarah and the general, understanding better than most the dangerous ground they were treading. She knew details about Sarah's classified operations that would never appear in official records, missions that were buried so deep in Black Ops files that even their existence was debatable. The political implications of this confrontation were staggering, and Hayes could see the potential for a scandal that would reach the highest levels of military leadership. Major Rodriguez felt his heart pounding as he remembered specific instances of Sarah's lethality that he had witnessed firsthand. During Operation Desert Viper, he had watched through binoculars as Sarah eliminated 6 enemy combatants in rapid succession, each shot placed with surgical precision while under intense hostile fire. Her actions that night had broken the back of an insurgent cell that had been terrorizing local villages for months. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes recalled a classified mission in Syria where Sarah had infiltrated an ISIS compound and systematically eliminated 12 terrorists who were planning a major attack on Western targets. The operation had required her to remain hidden for 3 days in enemy territory, making precise kills while avoiding detection by dozens of hostile forces. The intelligence gathered during that mission had prevented multiple terrorist attacks across Europe. But these men also understood the unwritten rules of military protocol. Speaking out in defense of Sarah would require them to violate classification levels and challenge a superior officer's judgment in a formal setting. They were trapped between their loyalty to a respected comrade and their obligation to maintain discipline and security protocols. Sarah finally moved, reaching slowly for the water glass beside her notepad. She took a measured sip, her actions deliberate and controlled, while General Thompson waited with obvious impatience for her response. The other officers watched her every movement, sensing that something significant was about to happen but unable to predict exactly what form it would take. When Sarah set down her glass and looked directly at General Thompson, her expression had changed subtly. The professional mask was still in place, but there was something deeper visible in her eyes now, something that spoke of experiences that went far beyond the sanitized world of Pentagon briefings and career advancement meetings. It was the look of someone who had stared into the abyss and emerged with a fundamental understanding of life and death that couldn't be taught in any military academy. "General Thompson," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a calmness that seemed almost supernatural given the circumstances, "I appreciate your concern about my qualifications for this mission. You're absolutely right that combat leadership requires a certain type of experience and mental fortitude that can't be measured through conventional metrics." Thompson nodded approvingly, believing that Sarah was about to concede his point and withdraw her application for the assignment. Several junior officers looked disappointed, having hoped to see their colleagues stand up to the general's obvious bias. The room felt charged with tension as everyone waited for Sarah's next words. "You've asked me about my kill count," Sarah continued, her tone remaining conversational despite the gravity of the subject matter. "It's an interesting question, and one that I don't often have occasion to discuss in mixed company. Most of my colleagues here understand that certain aspects of military service are better left unspoken, particularly when they involve classified operations and sensitive intelligence gathering. General Thompson's expression began to change as he detected something unexpected in Sarah's response. She wasn't backing down or making excuses. Instead, she was speaking with the quiet confidence of someone who possessed information that could dramatically alter the trajectory of the conversation. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face as he realized that perhaps he had misjudged the situation. Sarah paused for a moment, appearing to consider her words carefully. You see, General, the problem with discussing kill counts is that it reduces complex military operations to simple statistics. Each number represents not just an enemy eliminated, but a strategic objective achieved, intelligence gathered, and American lives saved. When you've been involved in the kind of operations that I've participated in, the numbers become less important than the outcomes. The room was absolutely silent now, with every officer hanging on Sarah's words. Even General Thompson had stopped fidgeting with his papers, his full attention focused on the woman he had just attempted to humiliate. There was something in her tone that suggested he was about to learn something he really didn't want to know. But, since you've specifically requested numbers, Sarah said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, I suppose I should be more forthcoming about my service record. The challenge, of course, is that much of my work has been classified at levels that prevent me from discussing specific operations or methodologies. What I can tell you is that my confirmed kill count stands at 167 enemy combatants eliminated during active combat operations. The number hit the room like a physical blow. Several officers stopped breathing entirely, while others began doing rapid mental calculations about what such a count might represent in terms of actual combat experience. General Thompson's face went pale as he realized that he had just challenged someone whose lethality exceeded that of most entire units. Sarah wasn't finished. Of those 167 confirmed kills, 93 were achieved through precision rifle fire at ranges exceeding 600 meters. 38 were accomplished during close-quarters combat using various weapons systems. The remaining 36 occurred during specialized operations that I'm not authorized to discuss in this setting, though I can say that they involve targets of significant strategic value to enemy organizations. The statistics continued to pour out of Sarah in a calm, methodical recitation that sounded like a technical briefing rather than a personal confession. Each number carried the weight of life and death decisions made under extreme pressure, of missions completed despite overwhelming odds, of enemies eliminated to protect innocent civilians and fellow soldiers. These engagements occurred across multiple theaters of operation, including Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Somalia, and several locations that remain classified. In each case, proper protocols were followed, and all kills were verified through multiple sources including direct observation, drone footage, and battlefield recovery operations. General Thompson sat frozen in his chair, realizing with growing horror that he had just questioned the combat record of someone whose experience far exceeded his own. The other officers in the room were equally stunned, though many felt a growing sense of admiration for Sarah's restraint in not immediately destroying the general's credibility when he first challenged her qualifications. But Sarah still wasn't finished with her quiet recitation of facts. The most devastating parts of her response were yet to come, and General Thompson was about to learn just how completely he had misjudged both the situation and the woman sitting across from him. Sarah's voice remained steady and professional as she continued her methodical recitation, each word carefully chosen and delivered with the precision of a surgeon's blade. The briefing room had become a courtroom, and she was presenting evidence that would forever change how everyone present viewed both her capabilities and General Thompson's judgment. Among those confirmed eliminations, Sarah continued, 47 were high-value targets identified by military intelligence as persons of significant strategic importance to enemy operations. These included 3 major cell leaders in Afghanistan, 2 weapons suppliers in Iraq, and a propaganda coordinator whose elimination disrupted enemy recruitment efforts across multiple provinces. General Thompson's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup, but he seemed to have forgotten how to coordinate the simple action. The magnitude of Sarah's revelations was beginning to sink in, and he was starting to understand that he had just questioned the combat record of someone who had single-handedly eliminated more enemy combatants than entire companies typically engaged during their full deployment cycles. Major Rodriguez felt a mixture of vindication and rage as he listened to Sarah calmly detail achievements that he had only partially witnessed. He remembered radio chatter during Operation Sandstorm when Sarah had provided overwatch for 3 separate units simultaneously, eliminating threats with such efficiency that the enemy forces had begun to retreat in panic, believing they were under attack by a much larger force. The longest confirmed kill in my record was achieved at a distance of 1,237 meters during an operation to neutralize a sniper team that had been targeting coalition convoys, Sarah said, her tone suggesting that she was reading from a grocery list rather than describing an act of remarkable marksmanship. The shot was taken in variable wind conditions with limited visibility, and it prevented the enemy from completing an ambush that would have resulted in significant casualties among supply personnel. Colonel Hayes closed her eyes, remembering the classified briefing where she had first learned about that particular engagement. The target had been a legendary insurgent sniper who had killed dozens of coalition soldiers over the course of 2 years. Multiple attempts to neutralize him had failed, and his psychological impact on friendly forces was becoming a serious operational concern. Sarah's single shot had not only eliminated the immediate threat but had also broken the morale of an entire enemy network. During my second deployment to Afghanistan, Sarah continued, I was assigned to Task Force Sentinel, a joint special operations unit tasked with dismantling terrorist networks in remote border regions. Over the course of 8 months, our team successfully eliminated 38 high-priority targets and captured 47 others for intelligence exploitation. She paused briefly, allowing the numbers to sink in before adding, my personal contributions to those operations included 23 confirmed kills and the successful infiltration of 6 enemy compounds. The intelligence gathered during those missions led to the disruption of 17 planned attacks against civilian targets and the arrest of over 200 suspected terrorists by local security forces. General Thompson felt perspiration beading on his forehead as he began to grasp the full scope of his miscalculation. He had challenged someone whose combat record was not only exemplary but bordered on legendary within certain classified circles. The woman he had dismissed as unqualified had apparently spent years conducting the exact type of high-stakes operations that he had suggested she couldn't handle. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes remembered fragments of conversations he had overheard during intelligence briefings, whispered references to a female operative who had become something of a ghost story among enemy forces. Insurgent communications intercepted by signals intelligence had mentioned a shadow woman who appeared without warning and eliminated key personnel with supernatural precision. He was beginning to realize that those stories might not have been exaggerations. The psychological warfare aspect of combat operations is something that I believe deserves special mention, Sarah said, her voice taking on a slightly different tone that suggested she was approaching the heart of her response. You mentioned earlier that effective combat leadership requires the ability to inspire fear in enemy forces. I can confirm that my reputation among hostile elements has indeed had significant psychological impact. She reached into her briefcase and withdrew a thin folder marked with multiple security classifications. The sight of the document caused several officers to stiffen, as they recognized the type of intelligence materials that were rarely seen outside of specialized briefings for cleared personnel only. During Operation Silent Thunder in eastern Afghanistan, our intelligence analysts intercepted enemy communications indicating that several insurgent groups had placed a bounty of $50,000 on my head, specifically because my activities were disrupting their operational effectiveness, Sarah explained with the same casual tone she might use to discuss the weather. The bounty revelation sent shock waves through the room. Most officers understood that enemy forces typically placed such rewards only on targets whose elimination would provide significant strategic advantage. The fact that Sarah had been worth $50,000 to terrorist organizations spoke to a level of operational impact that very few individual soldiers ever achieved. General Thompson's mouth opened and closed wordlessly as he struggled to process the implications of what he was hearing. He had built his entire challenge around the assumption that Sarah's combat record was somehow inflated or incomplete, but each new piece of information revealed the depth of his ignorance about her actual achievements. The intelligence community has designated my combat performance as falling within the 99th percentile for effectiveness among all deployed personnel, Sarah continued, turning pages in her folder as if she were reviewing routine administrative data. This assessment was based on confirmed kill ratios, mission success rates, intelligence gathering capabilities, and strategic impact measurements. She looked up from her folder and made direct eye contact with General Thompson for the first time since beginning her response. Her gaze was steady and unwavering, carrying the confidence that came from knowing that every word she had spoken was documented, verified, and unassailable. The evaluation also noted that my elimination of high-value targets had contributed to a measurable decrease in enemy recruitment and operational capacity within my assigned areas of responsibility. Several terrorist networks effectively ceased operations in regions where I had been active, either due to leadership elimination or because of the psychological impact of my presence. Major Rodriguez felt a surge of pride as he remembered the respect that Sarah had commanded not just from friendly forces, but from enemy combatants who had learned to fear her reputation. During joint operations with local security forces, he had witnessed Afghan commanders requesting specifically to work with the American woman sniper because they knew her involvement dramatically increased their chances of mission success. Sarah closed her folder and placed it back in her briefcase with deliberate care. The gesture signaled that she was approaching the conclusion of her response, though the room remained utterly silent as everyone waited to see how she would finish dismantling General Thompson's challenge. "So, General Thompson," she said quietly, "to answer your original question about whether I possess the kind of verified combat record necessary to lead critical operations, I believe the evidence speaks for itself. My kill count of 167 confirmed enemy eliminations places me among the most lethal individual operators in modern military history." The room remained frozen as Sarah's words sank in. General Thompson looked as if he might be having trouble breathing, while the other officers struggled to process the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. The woman they had known as a competent colleague had revealed herself to be something far more significant, a warrior whose achievements bordered on the mythical. But Sarah wasn't quite finished with her quiet devastation of the general's assumptions. Her final words would complete his humiliation and establish beyond any doubt that he had made an error in judgment that would haunt his career for years to come. Sarah placed her hands flat on the conference table and leaned forward slightly, her movement drawing every eye in the room to her face. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that seemed to press down on everyone present, the quiet authority of someone who had earned the right to speak with absolute certainty about matters of life and death. "General Thompson," she said, her words measured and deliberate, "I want to address your concern about my ability to project strength and intimidate enemy forces. You're absolutely correct that combat effectiveness depends heavily on psychological factors. What you might not realize is that my reputation among hostile elements extends far beyond simple kill counts or tactical achievements." She paused, allowing her words to settle before continuing. "During my final deployment in Afghanistan, enemy forces began referring to me in their communications as Malik al-Maut, the Angel of Death. This wasn't a term of endearment, General. It was born from genuine fear among insurgent ranks who had learned that my presence in an operational area meant that their leadership would begin disappearing with surgical precision. The Arabic phrase hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Several officers who understood the language felt their breath catch as they realized the significance of enemy forces giving Sarah such a designation. In militant Islamic culture, such titles weren't assigned casually, they reflected a level of fear and respect that bordered on supernatural dread. Intelligence intercepts during that deployment revealed that several major insurgent groups had actually relocated their operations to avoid areas where I was known to be active, Sarah continued, her voice never rising above a conversational level despite the devastating nature of her revelations. The psychological impact of my presence had effectively created dead zones for enemy activity across multiple provinces. General Thompson's face had gone ashen as he began to understand the full magnitude of his miscalculation. The woman he had dismissed as potentially unqualified was revealing herself to be not just competent, but legendarily effective in exactly the areas where he had questioned her capabilities. His challenge had backfired spectacularly, exposing his own ignorance rather than her inadequacy. Colonel Hayes felt a mixture of admiration and concern as she watched Sarah systematically dismantle the general's assumptions. She knew that this confrontation would have far-reaching consequences, not just for the immediate participants but for military culture as a whole. The story of this briefing would spread through informal channels, and it would change how many people thought about women in combat roles. "The Department of Defense has recognized my contributions with several commendations that I'm not permitted to discuss in detail due to their classified nature," Sarah said, her tone suggesting that even these revelations were merely the tip of a much larger iceberg. "However, I can say that my operational effectiveness led to recommendations for awards that have never been publicly announced due to the sensitive nature of the missions involved." Major Rodriguez remembered whispered conversations among special operations personnel about a female operator who had received medals that didn't officially exist, recognition for missions that had never happened, according to public records. The Black Ops community was small and tightly knit, and stories about Sarah's achievements had become the stuff of legend among those cleared to know about them. "But, perhaps most relevant to your concerns about leadership capability," Sarah continued, "is the fact that my last 3 combat deployments involved command responsibilities for joint special operations teams that included personnel from multiple allied nations. These weren't administrative positions, General. They were field commands where my decisions directly affected mission outcomes and the lives of soldiers under my authority." She reached again into her briefcase and withdrew a different folder, this one marked with even more restrictive security classifications. The sight of the document caused visible tension among the officers who recognized the significance of such materials being present in a routine briefing. The after-action reports from those operations consistently rated my leadership performance as exceptional, with specific praise for my ability to maintain unit cohesion under extreme stress and my tactical decision-making during complex combat scenarios, Sarah said as she briefly consulted the documents. One evaluation noted that my presence as a commander had a measurable positive impact on unit morale and combat effectiveness. The folder contained excerpts from classified reports that painted a picture of sustained excellence under the most challenging conditions imaginable. Sarah's leadership hadn't just been adequate, it had been exemplary in situations where failure would have meant not just mission compromise but significant loss of life among Allied forces. General Thompson sat motionless, his earlier confidence completely evaporated as he realized that every assumption underlying his challenge had been wrong. The woman he had attempted to dismiss had not only proven her qualifications but had revealed capabilities that exceeded those of most senior combat commanders. His public questioning of her record now appeared not just inappropriate but embarrassingly ignorant. "The reason I don't typically discuss these aspects of my service record," Sarah said as she closed the folder and returned it to her briefcase, "is that true warriors understand that our achievements speak for themselves through our actions, not our words. Mission success rates, unit survival statistics, and strategic impact assessments provide far more meaningful measures of effectiveness than boastful recitations of kill counts." Her words carried an implicit criticism of the general's approach to evaluating combat leadership, suggesting that his focus on crude metrics revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how modern warfare actually functioned. The rebuke was delivered so diplomatically that it might have seemed accidental to someone not paying careful attention. "I also prefer to let my record speak for itself because I understand that the taking of human life, even when necessary and justified, is not something to be celebrated or used for personal aggrandizement," Sarah continued, her voice taking on a slightly harder edge. "Each number in my kill count represents not just a tactical success, but a human being whose death was required to protect innocent lives and achieve strategic objectives." The moral weight of her statement hung heavily in the room. While General Thompson had treated kill counts as simple metrics for measuring professional competency, Sarah had revealed them to be profoundly personal burdens that she carried with appropriate gravity. Her approach demonstrated not just superior combat experience, but superior character in how she processed and understood that experience. Sarah stood slowly from her chair, her movement drawing everyone's attention as she prepared to deliver her conclusion. The action was perfectly calculated to command respect while maintaining the professional demeanor that had characterized her entire response. Every gesture reinforced her authority and competence. "General Thompson," she said, looking directly at him with steady eyes that betrayed no trace of anger or vindictiveness despite the public humiliation he had attempted to inflict upon her, "I believe I've adequately addressed your concerns about my qualifications for the proposed mission. Unless you have specific tactical or strategic questions about my operational approach, I suggest we proceed with the remainder of the briefing." The offer to move past the confrontation was delivered with such grace that it actually made the general's behavior appear even more petty and unprofessional by comparison. Sarah had not only defended herself effectively but had demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership temperament that would be required for high-stakes operations. The silence that followed lasted for nearly 30 seconds, an eternity in the context of a formal military briefing. General Thompson opened his mouth several times as if to speak, but no words emerged. His face cycled through various shades of red as he struggled to formulate any kind of response that wouldn't further compound his humiliation. Finally, Colonel Hayes cleared her throat and spoke into the vacuum. "I believe Colonel Martinez has provided a thorough response to the general's inquiries," she said diplomatically. "Perhaps we should proceed with the mission planning details." The remainder of the briefing passed in a subdued atmosphere, with General Thompson contributing little to the discussion and Sarah receiving the unanimous approval of the other officers for her assignment. The confrontation had fundamentally altered the dynamics in the room, establishing new hierarchies of respect that had nothing to do with rank insignia. As the meeting concluded and officers began filing out of the room, several approached Sarah privately to express their admiration for her restraint and professionalism. Major Rodriguez simply nodded to her with profound respect, while Lieutenant Colonel Barnes mentioned quietly that he would be honored to serve under her command again. General Thompson remained seated at the conference table long after everyone else had departed, staring at his notes as he contemplated the wreckage of his reputation and the hard lesson he had just learned about the dangers of making assumptions based on prejudice rather than facts. The woman he had attempted to humiliate had instead revealed him to be exactly the kind of leader the military could no longer afford, someone whose biases prevented him from recognizing excellence when it stood directly in front of him. The story of that briefing would indeed spread throughout military circles, but not in the way General Thompson had expected. Instead of establishing his authority, his challenge had become a cautionary tale about the consequences of underestimating people based on superficial characteristics rather than proven performance. Sarah Martinez had not just defended her qualifications, she had redefined how many people thought about combat leadership and the quiet strength that often proved more effective than loud bluster. In the years that followed, the mission she led would be remembered as one of the most successful special operations in recent military history, validating every word of her measured response to an ignorant challenge. And General Thompson would spend the remainder of his career wondering how different things might have been if he had simply respected the warrior sitting across from him instead of making assumptions about her capabilities based on nothing more than his own limited perspective.